Good morning, everyone. David McCoy, Ochimo Properties, Real Estate Matters. We're continuing our frequently asked questions on commercial real estate, and I'm continuing my focus on landlord issues. So today I thought we'd talk about what is triple net. We've talked about triple net before, and if you hear that term, it's usually said triple net. Sometimes people will say net, net, net. And just in a very quick definition, that means that the rent is net of insurance, taxes, and utilities. So what that means is that when they quote the rate, the income that they're getting from the rent does not include taxes, insurance, and the utilities. That varies a little bit for office versus industrial, but that's a good general definition. And so what that means is that the tenant is responsible for those expenses over and above their rent. Typically, I will see that those expenses will then be included in the CAM, the Common Area Maintenance. Although not necessarily. Sometimes people will quote it and it will be a triple net lease and they will mention CAM, and the CAM will not include those expenses. Probably the majority of the times, I would say, more than 90% of the time when someone is quoting CAM, that CAM includes those expenses. But it is possible that when they are mentioning CAM, they're limiting that to only maintenance expenses and not the insurance and taxes. So that's the way it works in the lease. The reason that this is important for the landlord is when the landlord is setting rent. I'm going to step back a little bit longer and talk a little bit more, and that is that sometimes you'll hear people say that it's a net lease or that it's a double net lease, or sometimes you'll hear them say it's a gross lease, or it's a modified gross lease, or it's a full service lease. And again, all of these terms, while they have a general definition, when someone talks about it, you have a rough idea of what they're talking about. I wouldn't say that any of them have a specific definition. And although you'll see sometimes quoted in textbooks or quoted on videos or information sources, sometimes they'll put a specific definition on that, but I would say in practice that there is not a definite definition. Different people will mean different things by that, and so you want to be clear you understand what people are talking about. In a gross lease is kind of the opposite of a net lease, and that means that if I'm quoting a gross rate, that I'm saying that in that rent we will pay those expenses. We will not expect the tenant to pay an additional rate over and above what we've quoted them for those expenses. Modified gross means that we'll pay some, but perhaps not all of those expenses. Lots of times people will talk about modified gross, where maybe they'll pay the taxes and insurance, but the individual tenant has separately metered utilities, and they ask them to pay that. Again, it's something that you just need to clarify as to what we're talking about. People will say full service lease as well. And when we talk about a full service lease, generally, again, you have to be clarifying on that. Some people will use the term full service interchangeably with a gross lease. But full service can mean more than that. It can mean that this covers your taxes, insurance, and utilities, but it might also cover other expenses such as janitorial, and it may even include some things like cable or other things like that. So they're close in meaning, but they're not necessarily exactly the same. Now, as a landlord, what you have to think about is there's really a few things. Obviously, from a tenant's perspective, they'd like to have all of those things included in the rent that you're charging, and so many times in the negotiation they will ask for that, and so I would say that that's more attractive to the tenant. I would also say that because these terms are somewhat confusing, sometimes you're at a bit of a disadvantage when you're including that rate, when you're having a higher rate, but it includes everything, because people who don't understand that may be looking at another rate that doesn't include those things and not realize that they would be paying the same or more when they're just looking those things up online or in advertising. So there's some things to think about there. A full service lease, people like that, especially I would say on higher end properties, in Class A properties. I mean, that often is very attractive. With Class A properties, lots of times you're charging a much higher rent. And so one of the things that makes that attractive to people is that they feel like a lot of their extra expenses are already covered in that rate. But there's some other issues as well, and some of that has to do with what are your plans with the building. One, you want to attract your tenant, and so you need to think about how you're pricing it and how you're advertising it and what you're including, what services are being included in that to attract your tenant. But another thing might be, is there a chance, what are your long-term plans for this property? And so, for instance, if you think that you might want to sell this property, if you want it to be an investment property, well, for investors prefer having tenants that are have triple net leases, and that kind of makes sense when they're evaluating their investment. And they're told what the income is, well, they're making an assessment based on that, on what their return is. And so they want that to be as simple as possible. I often say you should, if you're trying to have your property be a investment property, you should be trying to make that as close as possible to if they were investing in a CD, where they basically are just getting their check and they don't really have to spend a lot more effort than that on the property. And I think that makes sense. It's not that there aren't people who buy investment properties and run them and get tenants and things like that, because certainly there are. But lots of times that's like another job. And so investors, that many of them, they're not looking for a job. They probably already have a job. And so they're just looking for income. And so when you have a property, the closer you can get it to that kind of a situation, the more attractive it is as an investment property, if that's what you want to do. Now, that's not what everybody wants to do, but it's just a consideration. And so, anyway, like everything else I think that we've talked about, it's one of those things you just need to be clear on your definitions, and you need to think about what your purposes are with your property and how you want to attract your tenants and, the kind of return that you will get. So, I think that kind of wraps it up for now. Obviously, there can be a lot of different meanings for that, and I can understand that there might be some confusion over that. So if you have questions, please, give me a shout or leave me a comment or shoot me an email. I'd be glad to address them if I can. Also, if you have other topics of interest that you would like covered, I would be interested in knowing that as well. And so if you found that this video was helpful, I hope you will click like. If you think someone else might benefit from it, I hope you'll share it. And also, if you want to see future videos, I hope you will hit subscribe. So I hope everyone has a terrific day today, and I will see you guys next time. Take care. Bye. Puppy! Did it work?